You need to step aside. This lounge is not for people like you. Look at your clothes. Look at yourself. You don't fit our image, sir. This is a first-class lounge, and we have to protect the brand. If we let in anyone who waves a card, no matter what level, it wouldn't look right. This space is reserved for our real premium passengers. Please wait outside where you belong. Those were the exact words, spoken slowly, deliberately, each phrase like a hammer blow against dignity. They weren't shouted, but delivered with that professional coldness that wounds deeper than open cruelty. It was the kind of tone that says, "You are less, you are invisible, you are not worthy." And it came from a woman wearing a crisp uniform, standing behind a polished counter, the gatekeeper of comfort and privilege in one of the busiest airports in America. Before we continue, let me ask quickly, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe so you never miss these real stories, and tap the like button if this one hits you in the heart. Now let's return to that morning in Dallas-Fort Worth. Michael Carter, 50 years old, founder and CEO of Carter Airways, one of the largest airlines in the nation, a company with more than 32,000 employees and flights connecting 52 major American cities, walked quietly into his own lounge disguised as an ordinary traveler. He had traded the sharp navy suits that once put him on the cover of Forbes for a wrinkled shirt bought off the rack, khaki pants that sagged a little at the knees, and shoes scuffed at the heel. His beard was left untidy, glasses perched low on his nose. To the world, he looked like Marcus Hale, a retired schoolteacher taking a modest trip. But behind that disguise was the man who had built this airline from 2 leased planes and a folding table in a rented hangar. A man who had signed billion-dollar deals and testified before Congress. A man who had loaded luggage in the rain in his 20s and now signed off on acquisitions worth more than most small towns' annual budgets. None of that mattered in that moment. Not to the woman at the counter, not to the other passengers who glanced briefly at the scene. All they saw was a middle-aged black man in ordinary clothes, and for them that image meant second class, not first. Michael set his diamond card down firmly, a black and silver rectangle that symbolized over 1 million miles of loyalty, years of flights, money spent, promises kept. The manager, Karen Holt, barely looked at it. Her eyes flicked down, then back up to him, and with a faint smirk she pushed it back across the counter. "This isn't enough, sir. We'll need further verification. Please step aside." He said nothing. He picked up the card, turned, and walked to the plastic seats outside the frosted glass doors. Behind him he heard the click of heels and the warmth of a voice that had not been offered to him. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole. Your usual scotch is waiting." A white man in a charcoal blazer, carrying a designer briefcase, had walked up just as Michael was turned away. No ID check, no hesitation, only smiles and hospitality. The contrast was not subtle. It was deliberate, visible to everyone present, and yet no one said a word. Michael sat down, pulled out a small leather notebook with bent corners, and wrote calmly, "Dallas-Fort Worth, lounge access denied, reason given, not fitting image, manager, Holt, comparison, white male in blazer admitted without check." He wrote it without shaking hands, without tightening his jaw. He had been traveling undercover for more than a week already, observing, documenting. And what had happened now was not a surprise, only confirmation. He had seen it at boarding gates, when an elderly black woman was ignored as she struggled with her bag, while a younger white man was offered help before he even asked. He had seen it when a Latino couple in sweatshirts were told the upgrade list had closed, only to watch a solo white traveler with cufflinks escorted into first class minutes later. Each time, he wrote notes, collected details, built a record. But this moment in Dallas cut deeper, because it was no longer just what he saw happening to others. This time, it was him, the founder, the owner, the man who built the very airline that was now turning him into a second-class citizen inside his own house. He closed the notebook, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling lights that hummed too bright. He thought back to Harlem, where he grew up, where his mother taught him that respect is the first currency a man carries, long before money or titles. He thought about the early days when he and his friend Linda, now his chief operating officer, borrowed against their savings to lease 2 small planes, when he would clean the cabin himself after long flights. He thought about the promises he made then, that Carter Airways would be different, that it would not treat people based on what they wore, what they carried, or the color of their skin. Yet here he was, living proof that somewhere along the way, those promises had been broken. Around him, the terminal buzzed with announcements, rolling suitcases, children asking for snacks. Inside the frosted glass, leather chairs gleamed and crystal glasses clinked. Outside, Michael sat alone, invisible to the service that bore his name. He did not raise his voice. He did not call security. He did not reveal himself. He simply wrote another note, turned the page, and reminded himself why he was there. This was not a glitch. It was a pattern. This was not one bad employee. It was a culture. And if he didn't confront it now, no one else ever would. Michael Carter did not stop after Dallas. He had promised himself he would not judge the system by a single insult, no matter how cutting, but by a pattern, by evidence. And so he boarded one flight after another under the name Marcus Hale, the plain retired teacher with a wrinkled shirt and an old backpack. And he carried with him that battered notebook, the silent witness to everything he saw. On a short hop from Boston to Chicago, he chose a middle seat in the back, squeezed between a college student nodding off against the window and a businessman in a starched white shirt smelling of cologne. Michael watched the boarding gate carefully before the flight, and he saw a woman in her 60s, African-American, hair tied in a neat bun, standing patiently with her scuffed suitcase, her app clearly showing diamond status. But when she approached the desk, the agent barely glanced at her screen and told her she was too early and would need to wait. Only minutes later, a younger white man with earbuds and a leather duffel bag arrived. And the same agent leapt from his stool to shake his hand and escort him straight to the jet bridge with a smile, saying, "Welcome back, sir," as if the difference in luggage and skin color decided who was worthy. Michael wrote it all down, seat numbers, times, phrases, the kind of details that cannot be explained away by chance. On the connection to Denver, he noticed a couple wearing matching sweatshirts, both Latino, standing hopefully at the gate counter to ask about upgrades. They were told the list was already closed. No possibility. And they returned to their seats looking disappointed. 10 minutes later, a solo traveler, white, with a shiny watch and pressed quarter-zip pullover, asked the same question and was ushered into first class without hesitation. No list mentioned at all. No rules applied the same way. Again, Michael wrote it down, his pen steady, his mind calmer than his heart. He knew the sting of Dallas was not a mistake, not an isolated event. It was being repeated in different airports, different states, with different faces. But the same logic every time, the logic of appearance and the quiet filter of prejudice in Denver. He booked himself deliberately into row 22, a middle seat he could have avoided. But he wanted to see the small moments that never reached executive reports. He saw a young mother at the gate struggling to fold her stroller, her baby crying, her hands clumsy from exhaustion. The agent behind the counter watched, but did nothing. Simply waved her aside as if she were a nuisance. Then a man with perfect hair, sharp suit, and polished shoes appeared, and the same agent walked out from behind the counter to carry his briefcase on board like it was a crown jewel. Michael shook his head slowly and wrote, "Mother ignored. Business traveler assisted without asking." Later on that same flight, the attendants moved through the aisle, and Michael recognized one of them by her name tag, Diane Walker, who had walked past an older black passenger straining to lift his bag without offering help. but then stopped 2 rows later to assist a younger white man in designer sneakers who had not even asked. Michael noted her name, her face, her actions, because this was no longer about courtesy or oversight. It was about a pattern that showed itself again and again, each evening, in the privacy of his hotel rooms. He spread out the notebook pages across the desk, laying them side by side, drawing a thread that connected Boston, Chicago, Denver, and Dallas, and the picture that formed was unmistakable. He saw not one bad apple, not one grumpy agent, but a culture that rewarded those who looked the part, who carried the right brands, and who matched a narrow image of what premium meant. Those who did not. Often people of color, often travelers who dressed modestly, were asked to wait longer, verify more, or simply accept less. Michael traced his finger across the notes and felt a rising certainty. This was not just about customer service. It was about dignity, and his airline was failing the very promise he had made when he built it, on a return leg through Atlanta. At gate C-14, he sat in a chair near the counter, sipping cheap coffee, watching without writing yet, and he saw it unfold once more. An older gentleman, black, wearing a windbreaker and orthopedic shoes, diamond member tag clearly visible on his phone, stepped up to the counter. The young agent with too much gel in his hair looked up and said, "You're a little early, sir. We'll call by group," and sent him back to sit down. 10 minutes later, a white woman with a designer tote approached, and the same agent smiled, tapped her name on the screen, and explained her upgrade status in detail, encouraging her to wait only a short while. 2 customers with the same loyalty, the same rights, treated as though they lived in different worlds. Michael turned the page in his notebook and began to write when he felt a presence beside him. A man in his 50s sat down, set a canvas carry-on by his feet, and spoke quietly. "They did the same thing to me last month." Michael looked over, curious, and the man introduced himself as David Brooks, a longtime Diamond member, once a vice president of sales, now a consultant who traveled less formally, no longer in suits but in slacks and polos, and he explained that ever since he stopped dressing for the boardroom, his travel experience had changed. The greetings were colder, the upgrades fewer, the delays more frequent. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper from his bag and showed Michael his own notes, dates and flight numbers scribbled in the margins, evidence that confirmed everything Michael had been recording. Michael felt his pulse quicken, not from surprise, but from validation. He shook David's hand, gave his alias, Marcus Hale, and listened closely as David explained how loyalty seemed to matter only when you looked the part. When the boarding call came, they discovered they were seated side by side, aisle and window, and as they settled in, Michael slipped David's paper into his own notebook, a second voice in the growing choir of witnesses. The flight passed quietly, but Michael knew something had shifted. This was no longer just his observation, no longer his burden to prove. Other loyal passengers had seen it, lived it, tracked it, and no amount of polished reports from headquarters could erase their truth. The problem was bigger than one lounge manager in Dallas or one flight attendant in Denver. It was structural, spreading across multiple hubs, and if it was not confronted, it would destroy the very foundation of Carter Airways. As the plane descended toward Los Angeles, Michael looked out the window at the city lights and thought about his next step. The evidence was building, the pattern undeniable. But something in his gut told him he had not yet seen the full depth of the rot. He turned back to his notebook, wrote one final line that night. Pattern confirmed, culture broken, leadership blind, and closed it gently. He did not know it yet, but the next flight would give him the proof he needed, the kind of proof that could no longer be ignored. Michael Carter had filled pages of his notebook with patterns, moments, numbers, and names. But he knew patterns alone were not enough. What he needed was evidence that could not be explained away. Proof that the bias he was seeing was not just personal judgment, but an organized practice woven into the system. That proof came unexpectedly. On a late evening flight from Los Angeles to Chicago, when Michael deliberately booked himself into a back row seat, close to the restrooms, where tired travelers slumped against windows and attendants passed quickly without small talk. He settled in with his notebook tucked inside his jacket, prepared to jot down small observations, when a woman slid into the aisle seat beside him. He glanced once, then looked again. It was the same attendant he had seen in Denver ignoring the older black passenger and assisting the younger white traveler in sneakers, off duty now. She wore jeans and a navy hoodie with the Carter Airways logo across the chest. Her name was Diane Walker, early 30s, blonde hair pulled into a ponytail, scrolling quickly on her phone, thumbs flying with the practiced rhythm of someone deep in a conversation. Michael turned slightly toward the window, not wanting to attract notice, but the glow of her screen caught his eye. And then, in one frozen moment, he saw the name at the top of the thread, Thomas Reed. Michael's pulse tightened. Reed was no random colleague. He was the regional operations manager promoted after the acquisition of Western Eagle Airlines, a man who had gained influence quickly in the last 2 years, as Diane typed. Michael read the words appear. Some guy caused a scene at ATL Lounge, looked like a professor, kept insisting he was Diamond. Sarah made him wait outside. We flagged it. Michael kept his eyes fixed on the window, face calm, but every syllable seared into his memory. Seconds later, a reply appeared from Reed. Thanks. Watch for similar behavior at LAX. Same protocol. Diane's thumbs moved again. Already handled. Flagged him in the system. Re-verify ID at check-in. Random security if needed. Reed responded. You know the drill. Diane tapped a thumbs-up emoji and put her phone away. Michael sat motionless, heartbeat steady, but inside he felt the final piece lock into place. This was not unconscious bias, not individual mistakes. This was a protocol, written in the shadows, enforced by managers like Reed, carried out by attendants like Diane, designed to quietly identify and delay passengers who didn't look brand-aligned. For the first time since beginning this undercover mission, Michael felt fury rising, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that sharpens into resolve. The fury of a man who has built something with his own hands and now sees it twisted into something ugly. When the plane landed in Chicago, Michael checked into his hotel and opened his notebook on the desk, laying out his notes beside fresh documents that Linda Barrett, his COO and most trusted partner, had discreetly sent from headquarters. Together, they painted a chilling picture. Reed's fingerprints were everywhere in the last year of internal memos, hidden behind phrases like customer optics standardization and streamlining high-value prioritization. The language sounded corporate and harmless, but when cross-referenced with system logs Linda had uncovered, the reality was stark. Flags were being entered into the system by hand, not triggered by seat class or loyalty tier, but manually, by employees who were deciding, based on appearance, who looked premium and who did not. These manual overrides resulted in additional ID checks, random security screenings, delays in upgrades, and, most painfully, exclusion from lounges, and the numbers were damning. More than 200 passengers flagged across 4 hubs in just 12 months. The majority people of color, travelers who dressed plainly, families carrying budget luggage, customers who had paid and earned their loyalty like anyone else, yet were quietly categorized as off-brand. Michael flipped through his notebook, each entry now no longer anecdote but evidence. Evidence of a system that had betrayed not only the passengers but his original vision. He remembered the early days when Carter Airways was nothing but 2 planes and a dream, when he promised himself no one would be treated as less because of how they looked, when he told his mother, who scrubbed floors to feed him, that one day he would build something better, something fair. And now, his own managers were undoing that promise, teaching employees that dignity was conditional. He barely slept that night, staring out the window of his downtown hotel at the city lights flickering against the glass. He saw in his mind the face of the elderly woman struggling with her bag, the Latino couple dismissed at the gate, the black man in the windbreaker told to wait, David Brooks with his folded sheet of notes, and himself sitting outside the lounge in Dallas with his diamond card dismissed like trash. He saw Diane's phone screen, Reed's words, same protocol, and he felt the weight of betrayal. The problem was no longer hidden. It was staring him in the face. And it was not just a culture issue. It was structural, sanctioned by management, spread quietly across the system, infecting the heart of the airline. He realized then that the notebook he carried was not just a diary of observations. It was a weapon, a record of truth that could not be denied, and he would use it. But he also knew that Reed and his allies would not go quietly. There would be resistance, excuses, attempts to bury the evidence. That did not matter. Michael had faced storms before, from bankruptcy threats to lawsuits to hostile takeovers, and he had never backed down. This battle, however, was not about profits or market share. It was about respect, the first currency his mother taught him, the currency his company had squandered, and he was ready to reclaim it. He closed the notebook, placed it carefully beside the lamp, and whispered to himself words he had not spoken in years. They think no one is watching. They're wrong. The next morning he shaved his beard, pressed a clean suit, and prepared for the next stage, not as Marcus Hale, the invisible passenger, but as Michael Carter, CEO, a man with proof in his hand and justice in his eyes. Michael Carter returned to Chicago not as Marcus Hale, the quiet traveler, but as himself, the CEO, the man ready to dig deeper. And the first person he called into his office was Linda Barrett, his chief operating officer and the one person he trusted to cut through noise and find the truth. Linda arrived with a stack of files, her silver hair pulled back, her face set in the serious calm of someone who had seen too much in her decades at his side. Together they sat in the glass-walled office high above the city, where planes arched like silver arrows across the horizon, and they began to lay out the evidence piece by piece. Michael spread his notebook on the table, pages crowded with observations, names, times, small humiliations that together told a big story. Linda added the digital records she had pulled from the back end of the airline's systems, reports that most executives never read because the numbers seemed routine. But when you looked closely, the pattern was unmistakable. Over 240 passengers had been flagged in the last year under the category verification required. And when she cross-referenced those flags with demographic information and customer surveys, the truth came into focus. The overwhelming majority of those flagged were people of color, passengers with non-English names, or travelers who boarded in casual clothing rather than suits. The system showed that 48% of flagged passengers were black, 23% Latino, and another 11% Asian, while only 18% were white. Yet in the general customer base, those numbers were reversed, meaning white passengers almost never faced additional checks even when their loyalty status was identical. Michael stared at the charts in silence, his jaw tight, because this was not bias whispered behind a counter. It was bias baked into process, carried out hundreds of times without anyone in headquarters stopping to ask why. Linda turned her laptop and showed him email chains between Reed and regional supervisors, messages filled with coded language. Ensure premium image, Reed wrote. Avoid upgrades for those who do not align with brand optics. And in another, manual flagging is encouraged to protect perception. The words were polished, careful, but everyone in those chains knew exactly what they meant. Michael remembered sitting outside that lounge in Dallas, hearing Karen Holt tell him he did not fit the image. And now he understood it was not just her arrogance, but Reed's policy whispering through her lips. He felt a burn in his chest, not of shame, but of anger at himself for not catching it sooner, for trusting managers who measured success in speed and efficiency without asking what those efficiencies cost in human dignity. Linda leaned back, sipping her black coffee, and said flatly, "This is bigger than one manager. Michael, this is systemic, and if we don't root it out, it will destroy us from the inside." Michael nodded, remembering his mother's words. That respect is the first currency. And he realized that respect had been devalued by people chasing an illusion of premium service. The irony was heavy. The very policy meant to create loyalty among high-value customers was alienating the most loyal of all, the diamond flyers who had stuck with Carter Airways for years. And the financial consequences were already visible. Linda pulled up survey data showing a 9% drop in satisfaction among top-tier members in the past 12 months. A trend that forecast hundreds of millions in lost revenue if unchecked. One report even included a handwritten complaint from a black business traveler who wrote, "I spend more than $40,000 a year on flights, yet I am treated like a suspect while men in suits walk past me. Maybe it is time I take my business elsewhere." Michael closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve. They worked late into the night, page after page, building a case not just of anecdotes but of hard evidence, data that would stand in front of a boardroom and silence excuses. At one point, Linda found a training module quietly rolled out in 3 regional hubs, a so-called customer prioritization guide that instructed staff to identify brand-aligned passengers and fast-track their requests. The guide never mentioned race, never mentioned class, but the photos used as examples told the truth. White businessmen in suits labeled as premium, black and brown travelers in casual clothes labeled as standard. Michael pushed the laptop away in disgust. "They put discrimination into a slideshow," he said softly. Linda nodded grimly. "And they thought no one would notice." By midnight, they had built a dossier 3 inches thick, containing internal memos, flagged system logs, training slides, and the damning notes from Michael's own undercover journey. At the top of the file sat one name, Thomas Reed. His rise after the Western Eagle acquisition had been swift, his efficiency praised, but never once had his reviews measured customer dignity, only throughput and cost savings. Michael realized that Reed had taken the soul of the airline and traded it for numbers that looked good in quarterly reports. That trade had infected frontline staff, who now believed they had permission to judge passengers by appearance, to deny services with a smile, to measure worth by brands and skin tones rather than loyalty or humanity. Michael sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples, and asked the question that had been heavy in his mind since Dallas. "How deep does this go?" Linda answered carefully. "Deep enough that Reed isn't alone. Holt in Dallas, Walker in Denver, Rowe in LAX. They're all part of it. But Reed is the architect, and if we cut him out, the system collapses." Michael looked out the window at the blinking lights of planes taking off, the same planes he once loaded baggage onto in the rain, and he whispered to himself, "This airline was built on sweat, not on suits. We will not let it fall to this." Linda closed the file and placed it firmly on the table. "Tomorrow we bring this to the board," she said. "They won't like it, but they can't ignore it, not when the evidence is this strong." Michael nodded, his face set, the fury of Dallas now shaped into strategy. He had gone undercover to find a problem. Now he had found a disease, and he carried in his hands both the diagnosis and the cure. The next step would not be quiet observation or secret notes. The next step would be confrontation. And in that confrontation, Men like Reed would discover that the black man they thought didn't belong in a lounge was the owner of the entire airline, the man who had the power to fire them before lunch. The next morning, the boardroom of Carter Airways filled slowly. 14 members sliding into their leather chairs around a long, polished table, some still checking their phones, some murmuring about their schedules, a few already bracing for a confrontation they did not yet fully understand. At the head of the room, Michael Carter stood in silence. A thick dossier of evidence laid neatly in front of him, his notebook beside it, his face calm, but his eyes burning with the quiet fury of a man who had seen the truth with his own eyes. Linda Barrett stood at his side, ready to handle the slides and documents, her expression tight with focus, when the last member arrived and the door closed. Michael did not open with pleasantries. Instead, he said, his voice low but clear, "What I am about to share is not a report, not speculation, and not rumor. It is evidence, and it demands immediate action." The room shifted, a few board members leaning back, one clearing his throat, another glancing at his watch. But Michael pressed forward. He began with the story of Dallas, how the lounge manager told him he did not belong, how a white traveler was welcomed with a drink while his own diamond card was pushed aside, and though a few members started to smile as if to dismiss it as anecdote. Those smiles faded as Michael opened his notebook and read aloud, page after page, not of opinions, but of dates, times, names, and words quoted verbatim. He described Boston, where a black woman was told to wait while a white man was escorted forward. Chicago, where a Latino couple was denied upgrades while a white businessman was bumped up with ease. Denver, where a black father was ignored with his bag while a younger white traveler was helped without asking. Atlanta, where a black diamond member was brushed off while a white woman with a designer tote was coddled with details. Each story by itself might have been explained away, but together they formed a pattern no one could deny. Then Linda placed charts on the screen. Hard data from the system logs. More than 240 passengers flagged in the past year. 80% of them people of color. Flagged not by status or payment, but manually. By employees deciding who looked premium and who did not. Murmurs ran through the room. Uneasy shuffling of papers. But Michael raised his hand and silenced them. "Do not mistake this for unconscious bias," he said, voice hardening. "This was organized, it was policy, and it came from one of our own managers." He turned the next page and showed emails from Thomas Reed. Phrases like, "protect the premium image," and "brand-aligned passengers only," flashing on the screen. Words that looked corporate until paired with photos from training slides. Where white businessmen in suits were labeled premium and black and brown travelers in hoodies were labeled standard. Gasps rippled. One board member muttered, "My God," another whispered, "How did this get past us?" But one voice broke through. Larson, a longtime investor known for his bluntness, who leaned forward and said, "Michael, this is troubling. But we cannot overreact. You know as well as I do that appearance matters to premium clients. If we dismantle these protocols, we risk alienating the very customers who pay the most." The room stiffened, and for a moment it seemed Larson had spoken aloud the excuse many were thinking. But Michael turned on him with a glare so sharp it cut the air. "Appearance matters? Tell me. Larson, did you think appearance mattered when I was cleaning baggage carts in the rain to keep this airline alive? Did you think appearance mattered when I mortgaged my own home to lease the first 2 planes? If appearance mattered, I would not be standing here. Because no one thought a black kid from Harlem looked like a CEO, and yet here I am, and here we are, because appearance never built this airline. Respect did." The room fell silent. Larson's face flushed, and Michael pressed the moment. "If your definition of premium excludes skin color, then you do not deserve your seat at this table. If we keep these protocols, we will not only lose customers, we will lose the soul of this company." He let the silence stretch. then laid out the terms. Immediate suspension of all discretionary override protocols. Termination of employees who had abused the system. Mandatory retraining for all frontline staff with independent oversight. And the creation of a permanent passenger advisory council made up of real customers reporting directly to his office. "This will be expensive," the CFO warned, voice trembling as he flipped through numbers. Michael leaned forward, eyes locked, and said, "Not as expensive as a class action lawsuit, not as expensive as lost loyalty, not as expensive as betraying the trust of the very people who built us," another board member asked quietly. "Michael, you're saying you went undercover yourself?" Michael held up his notebook. 2 weeks, 10 cities, no perks, no corporate account, just me and this notebook. I was flagged for secondary verification 3 times in 4 cities while wearing a $39 jacket. You think this is anecdotal? Explain that to me? The room froze. No rebuttal left. And slowly heads began to nod when the vote was called. 10 members voted yes, 2 abstained. None dared oppose. The reforms were passed. Michael did not smile, did not celebrate. He only gathered his papers, stood tall, and said, "This is not the end, this is the beginning. I am not here to save face. I am here to change the face of this company." The meeting ended with silence, broken only by the sound of chairs pushing back, but every person in that room knew something had shifted. By sunset that day, 17 employees had been suspended or terminated, including Thomas Reed, summoned to the executive floor under false pretense and confronted by Michael himself. A confrontation that lasted less than 10 minutes, but ended the career of the man who thought prejudice could be hidden behind policy. Reed left the building with his badge revoked, his access cut, and his reputation in shreds, while Michael stood at his window looking out at the runways, the city lights, and the blinking red dots of planes climbing into the night sky, and he whispered to himself that the real battle was only just beginning, because dismantling a culture takes more than firing a few names. It takes rebuilding trust from the ground up, and tomorrow he would begin that fight. The news spread through Carter Airways like fire racing along dry grass. Whispers in crew rooms, hurried messages between flight attendants, nervous looks from gate agents, because by dawn the word was out that the CEO himself had gone undercover, had been humiliated in his own lounge, and had returned with a list of names, and now those names were about to face the consequences. Security escorted Karen Holt, the Dallas lounge manager, into a small conference room where Michael Carter sat waiting, not in fury, but in that calm silence that cuts deeper than yelling. She tried to explain, saying it was just procedure, that she was protecting brand image, that she had never meant to discriminate. But Michael slid across the table a copy of her own internal chat with Reed, where she had written, "He didn't look premium. Better to keep him outside." Her face drained of color. She whispered, "I didn't know it was you." Michael leaned forward, his voice steady. "That's the problem. Karen, it should not matter if it was me or anyone else. Respect is not optional." Her termination letter was signed before lunch, and within hours she was escorted from the airport she once controlled. In Denver, Diane Walker, the flight attendant who had texted Reed about flagging passengers, received her notice of dismissal with HR present. She argued, pleaded, insisted she was following orders. But the screenshots of her messages spoke louder than her words, and Michael told her plainly, "When you chose to enforce injustice, you made yourself responsible." At Los Angeles International, Kevin Rowe, a gate agent linked to dozens of manual flags, was removed mid-shift, the shocked looks of passengers filming on their phones, clips that later went viral with captions like, "Airline finally cleans house." But the greatest reckoning came for Thomas Reed himself, summoned to the 38th floor of headquarters. He walked in with his usual smug stride, but stopped when he saw only Michael waiting with a folder on the table. "Mr. Reed," Michael said without rising. "Please sit." Reed tried to maintain composure, insisting the so-called optics protocol was misunderstood, that it was designed to streamline service. But Michael opened the folder and revealed the emails, the training slides, the statistics, and finally his own undercover notes. "You wrote policies that gave people permission to decide who mattered based on appearance and color," Michael said, voice like steel. "And you thought no one was watching. You were wrong." Reed tried to deflect, then threatened to bring investors into the fight, but Michael cut him short with a single sentence. "You no longer work here." Security entered, removed Reed's badge, and walked him past staff who filmed with their phones. By evening, his name was trending online as passengers shared their own stories of humiliation. Stories now tied directly to his downfall. The impact did not stop inside the company. National media picked up the story. Headlines screaming, "Airline CEO humiliated at his own lounge. Secret protocol discriminates against passengers." And "Carter Airways cleans house after bias scandal." Cable news ran the footage of Holt leaving the Dallas terminal in silence. Diane covering her face from cameras. Reed refusing to answer questions as reporters shouted, "Did you target Black and Latino passengers?" Stock analysts predicted turbulence. The share price dropped 4% in a single day. But many customers cheered, booking flights in support, leaving comments like, "Finally a CEO who calls it out," and "This airline may lose money now, but it's gaining trust." For the staff still employed, the message was clear. Michael hosted a live broadcast to all 32,000 employees, sleeves rolled to his elbows, speaking not as an executive, but as a man who had walked in their shoes. 17 employees have been removed because they chose image over integrity, he said, pausing as silence stretched across break rooms and terminals. But this is not about punishment. It is about change, starting today. No one in this company will decide who matters by how they look. Every passenger counts. Every time. The words echoed through airports, and many employees bowed their heads, some in shame, others in relief. For Holt and Walker. The consequences stretched beyond termination. Customers who had filmed their behavior filed formal complaints. Civil rights organizations announced they were reviewing potential legal action, and lawyers began circling with talk of discrimination suits. Reed faced the harshest fall. His emails and policies were subpoenaed by a federal inquiry, and within weeks he was forced to testify before regulators, sweating under bright lights as senators asked, "Did you knowingly authorize a system that profiled passengers based on appearance?" His denials rang hollow against the documents Michael's team had already provided. And though no prison sentence followed immediately, Reed's career in aviation was finished, his reputation destroyed, his name synonymous with bias in business schools and leadership forums. Meanwhile, Michael's decision to go public rather than bury the scandal marked a turning point. Passengers who had once stayed silent began sharing their stories online. Hashtags like #EveryPassengerCounts and Respect in the Sky trended nationwide. Some accounts were heartbreaking. A Black mother describing how her teenage son was asked for ID 3 times at a gate. An elderly Latino couple forced to prove their upgrade twice while watching younger white passengers breeze past. An Asian American businessman told his seat was unavailable until a colleague intervened. Each story reinforced the truth that Michael had uncovered, that dignity had been rationed out based on skin tone and clothing, and the reckoning was overdue. In the days that followed, Michael worked 18-hour stretches, meeting with HR, with legal, with diversity advisors, rewriting training manuals, scrapping entire modules, and issuing new directives that banned discretionary flagging outright. He announced a $75 million fund to compensate passengers who had been wrongfully flagged, a fund to be managed by an independent board, including civil rights leaders and frequent flyer representatives. He also announced that every executive, including himself, would spend 3 days each year working in frontline roles, from check-in counters to baggage handling, so they would never again forget what service looked like from the ground up. Some investors grumbled at the cost, but Michael answered them in one sentence: "The cost of injustice is always greater." By the end of the week, the company was transformed, its culture shaken but awake. Employees spoke quietly of the shock of seeing senior managers escorted out, but many admitted privately that it had needed to happen for years. Customers began to return, not because fares were cheaper, but because they believed something real was changing. And through it all, Michael carried his notebook, now nearly full, the pages stained with ink and resolve, knowing that the reckoning was not finished, but had only begun. For Karen Holt, there would be years of rebuilding her life. For Diane Walker, the loss of a career she once loved. For Thomas Reed, the permanent stain of having authored discrimination. But for Michael, the judgment day meant something else entirely. Not revenge, not even justice alone, but the opportunity to keep a promise he had made long ago in Harlem to his mother, that if he ever built something of his own, he would make sure no one who walked through its doors would be told they did not belong. 6 months later, Carter Airways looked and felt like a different company. Not because the planes were new or the uniforms had changed, but because the culture had shifted in ways passengers and employees could feel the moment they stepped into a terminal. Gone were the suspicious glances at people in hoodies or worn shoes. Gone were the quiet delays for passengers with brown or black skin. Gone were the whispered policies that decided worth by brand names. In their place was a new standard, written on every training document and printed on posters in break rooms. 3 simple words in bold type: "Every passenger counts." Michael Carter had stood before his people in broadcast after broadcast, repeating that phrase until it sank into the bones of the company. And now, traveling families noticed attendants smiling first. Elderly passengers saw gate agents step forward to help without hesitation, and Diamond members no longer had to dress in suits to prove their loyalty. Customer satisfaction scores rose by 27%, a figure that analysts initially doubted but later confirmed, and new bookings increased as news spread that Carter Airways was serious about dignity. Other airlines, at first dismissive, began to follow quietly, rolling out their own reforms, citing Carter Airways as the case study, and industry conferences buzzed with the phrase Michael had coined in his final broadcast: "Respect is not a feature, it is the flight." For Michael himself, the past months had been grueling. He had testified before Congress about discrimination in the skies, had faced hostile questions from investors worried about costs, had met privately with civil rights leaders who demanded accountability. But through it all, he carried that battered leather notebook that still smelled faintly of ink and airport coffee. On its last page, he had written a single sentence: "Respect restored, but never finished." He read it to himself often, a reminder that reform is not a destination, but a journey. Linda Barrett, his trusted COO, teased him gently that he had become more preacher than executive. But even she admitted the reforms were working, and she told him one evening over coffee, "Michael, you've done what few CEOs ever manage. You've taken a crisis and turned it into a legacy." He smiled, tired but grateful, and answered, "We only just began. A legacy only lasts if the next generation carries it forward." That truth revealed itself in small moments. In Dallas, the very lounge where he had been told he did not belong, an elderly black couple walked in holding hands, their clothes plain, their suitcases scratched from years of use, and the agent at the desk smiled warmly, checked their cards, and walked around to guide them in personally, watching from a distance. Michael felt his chest loosen, because that simple act was the proof he needed that change had reached the ground level in Atlanta. A Latino teenager traveling alone was greeted by name, upgraded without question because of his loyalty points. and the look on his face as he realized he mattered to the company was a mirror of Michael's own childhood dreams. And perhaps the most powerful moment came at JFK, when a young black boy clutching his mother's hand approached the gate nervously, his mother whispering that it would be fine. And before either could speak, the agent knelt down, smiled at the boy, and said, "Welcome aboard, young man. You belong here." Michael heard those words from across the terminal and felt tears sting his eyes, because it was the exact opposite of the words that had humiliated him months earlier, and it meant the cycle had been broken. The consequences for the former offenders remained heavy. Karen Holt found herself facing lawsuits from passengers whose videos had gone viral, and her name became a cautionary tale in management training. Diane Walker tried to move to another airline but was barred for a decade under federal sanctions. A stark reminder that following bad orders is still a choice. Thomas Reed vanished from aviation altogether, his career ruined, his policies dissected in business schools as an example of how bias disguised as efficiency corrodes trust. Yet Michael took no joy in their downfall. When asked by a reporter if he felt vindicated, he answered, "Accountability is not about revenge. It is about correction, for them, for us, and for everyone watching." That humility only strengthened public support, and Carter Airways became not only a successful airline, but a symbol of what corporate leadership could look like when conscience outruns profit. The financial picture, once grim, had recovered, though the airline lost $200 million in the immediate aftermath. By the 6th month, loyalty renewals had spiked, new corporate contracts were signed, and analysts projected the reforms would generate $500 million in long-term goodwill. More importantly, employees who once felt voiceless now spoke up when they saw problems, because Michael had opened anonymous channels that reported directly to his office, and he read those reports himself, sometimes replying personally. He told them in one broadcast, "If you see something wrong and stay silent, you are complicit. If you speak, you are the guardian of our values." That message echoed beyond Carter Airways, into workplaces across the country, quoted in speeches, printed in articles, even appearing on posters at airports that were not his own. As summer rolled into fall, Michael decided it was time to close the notebook for good. He called a company-wide broadcast, not with a teleprompter, but with the same sleeves rolled to his elbows, the same steady voice that had carried him from Harlem to the top of American aviation. He spoke plainly. 6 months ago, I was told to wait outside my own lounge because I did not look the part. Today, that lounge, and every lounge in this company, belongs to every passenger who has earned it. We have a long way to go, but we are walking together, and we will not turn back. When I was 19, stranded in an airport with no money and no help, a gate agent told me, "You'll figure it out." That night I promised myself that if I ever built something, no one would be left behind. I forgot that promise for a while, but I remember it now, and I will not forget again. He let the silence hang, then finished with the line that had become his signature. Respect is not a feature. It is the flight. As the red light on the camera dimmed, employees across the nation stood quietly, some with tears, some with pride, all with the weight of history on their shoulders. And somewhere in the crowd of millions watching online, a young boy, skin dark like Michael's, eyes wide with hope, whispered to his mother, "I want to be like him." That was the legacy, not the planes or the profits, but the seed planted in the heart of the next generation, a seed watered by courage, honesty, and the refusal to stay silent when silence meant complicity. Michael Carter walked back to his office, closed the notebook, and placed it on the shelf, not as a record of shame, but as a monument to change, proof that one man with a pen, a disguise, and a promise to his mother could still bend the course of an entire industry. and as he looked out the window at a Carter Airways plane rising into the sky, engines roaring, lights blinking against the horizon, he whispered to himself, "We belong here, all of us." Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, leave a comment, give it a like, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you more meaningful stories.